Good afternoon, sixth graders. It's Mrs. Hebert, and we are going to be starting Module 6. Module 6 has to do with ratios, and so for Lesson 6.1, we're going to add that to our table of contents in our math notebooks. So the lesson is 6.1, the title is Ratios, and the pages should be 27 and 28. Okay, so setting up your page, when you get to page 27, you need to write 6.1 and ratios at the top, and then you need 5 boxes. The first 2 boxes will be longer. 3 and 4 don't have to be as big, and then 5 is all the way across. It's not very tall, but it's all the way across. Okay, for box number 1, I'm going to have you write the definition of a ratio, because what is a ratio? Well, a ratio is a comparison of 2 quantities or 2 amounts. So if I have 3 apples and 2 oranges, my comparison would be 3 to 2 because I have 3 apples to 2 oranges. I could also say, the ratio of boys to girls in the class is 13 to 12. 13 boys to 12 girls. Those are all ratios. So in the example I have for the box, we're going to keep it very simple, and we're going to draw 3 stars and 1 circle. Okay, so in this example, we're comparing stars to circles, and so we would say the ratio of stars to circles would be 3 stars to 1 circle. So we would call that 3, we would say that is 3 to 1. So go ahead and fill that in, go ahead and write that in. 3 to 1. It's kind of hard to see. Let me go over it. The ratio of circles to stars, however, if I say the circles first, I have 1 circle and I have 3 stars. So the ratio of circles to stars is 1 to 3. But I can also compare, I can do a ratio of stars to the total number of shapes. So I have 3 stars and I have 4 total shapes. So the ratio of stars to total shapes would be 3 stars to 4 total shapes, or 3 to 4. And then the ratio of circles to total shapes would be 1 circle to the 4 shapes. And that is how I would write those ratios. That's one way to write those ratios, to compare my stars and my circles. Okay, in box 2, we're going to write some ratios. And the key to writing ratios is that you must write the ratios in the correct order. So you have to write the ratio in the order that it existed. So in our previous box, in box number 1, you don't have to write this part, but I'm just going to draw it in here to remind you. We had 3 stars to 1 circle. You can write it if you want to. So I'm going to write the ratios, and because I'm comparing stars to circles, I have to put the number for the stars first and the circles later. So my ratio would be 3 stars to 1 circle. And I can write it that way with the word 2 between the 2 numbers. I can also write it with a colon, and I would read it the same way, so it would be 3 colon 1. And we read that the same way. We say that's 3 to 1. So 3 stars to 1 circle. And the last way we can write it is like a fraction, because a ratio is a fraction. And we can say 3 to 1. And you think of the fraction line as the 2. And so you have to go from top to bottom when you write it. So 3 to 1, because we have 3 stars to 1 circle. Okay, when looking at ratios, we also need to be able to recognize when we have equivalent ratios. And equivalent ratios are ratios that name the same comparison. So go ahead and write that definition down. And then for the examples, we're going to do 2 examples. But before we do those, I want to talk to you a little bit about it. So if I have the fraction 2/7, one way that I can find an equivalent ratio is by multiplying the top and bottom by the same number. So if you think of a ratio as a fraction, because that's what it is, when I'm looking for an equivalent ratio, I'm going to be looking for an equivalent fraction. Okay, so if I have 2/7, I can multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number to get an equivalent fraction or an equivalent ratio. So in this case, I'm going to multiply 2 times 2. And if I multiply 2 times 2, that's supposed to be 2 times 2 there with an arrow. That's going to give me 4 at the top. If I multiply 7 times 2, that gives me 14. So 2/7 and 4/14 are equivalent ratios. So I can multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number and get an equivalent ratio. I can also find an equivalent ratio by dividing by the same number. So in my second example, I have 9/12. I'm going to divide 9, I'm going to divide it by 3, and that's going to give me 3. And then I'm going to divide 12 by 3, and that's going to give me 4. So 9/12 is equivalent to 3/4. So 9/12 is equivalent to 3/4. So 9/12 and 3/4 are equivalent ratios. So again, I can either multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number or divide the numerator and denominator by the same number. And those will both give me equivalent ratios. Okay, so there are a couple of things you're going to be asked to do. And so I'm going to give you an example. We'll call this example 1. We'll put this in box 4. And there are going to be 2 different kinds of questions you may be asked when being asked to compare ratios. The first thing is, the first one for A says write 3 equivalent ratios. If they ask you to write equivalent ratios, they're asking you to either multiply or divide by the same number to get equivalent ratios. So in order to do that, I can say 8/10. I can divide 8 and 10 by 2. If I divide 8 by 2, I get 4. And if I divide 10 by 2, I get 5. So 8/10 is equivalent to 4/5. I can also multiply. I can say 8 times 2 is 16, and 10 times 2 is 20. So 16/20 is equivalent to 8/10. And I'll do one more because I need 3. I'm going to say 8, let me see, how do I want to do it? I will do 8 times 3 is 24, and 10 times 3 is 30. And that is also an equivalent ratio. Now, I could also look at this and I could say, well, I could come up with an equivalent ratio to 4/5. And an equivalent ratio to 4/5, if I multiplied 4 by 3, it would give me 12. And 5 times 3 is 15. So 12/15 is also an equivalent ratio, even though I can't multiply 8/10 by a whole number to get 12 and 12/15. I hope that makes sense. But if not, don't worry about the last part just yet. I'll explain that a little better in class, or we can go over that in class. But definitely 4/5, 16/20, and 24/30 are all equivalent ratios. Then B, they're also going to ask you to write the ratio of 8 to 10 in 3 ways. So if they ask you to write a ratio in 3 ways, what they want you to do is use the 3 ways that we wrote it in box number 2. So if they want you to write 8 to 10, one of the ways is going to be 8/10, which is 8/10. 8 to 10, just like you would say it with the word 2, and 8:10. And these all mean 8 to 10. Okay, looking at example 2 for box number 5, they're going to ask you, we're just going to review, and we're going to write the ratios for the following. I have in this picture 4 x's and 2 o's, and they don't have to be together. So if I'm going to write a ratio for x's to o's, I have to do it in the order that they ask for it. So they ask for me to do x's first. So there are 4 x's, 2, how many o's? And there are 2 o's. So I can do, and I can write it any of the 3 ways. So I'm going to write this one with a colon, 4 to 2, because there are 4 x's to 2 o's. If I write o's to x's, I have to do the o's first. So that would be 2, and I'm going to write it a different way this way. This time 2 to 4. But I can write it either way. Then x's to total letters, I can compare each of those to the total set of letters. I have 6 letters total there because I have 4 x's and 2 o's. That's 6 letters. So I can say my ratio of x's to total letters would be 4 to 6. So I'm going to do a colon. And then o's to total letters would be 2 to 6. But I could write those really in any format. Either I could write 4 to 2 as 4 to 2 with the word 2, and I could also write it as a fraction of 4 to 2. I could do 2 to 4 as 2 to 4, and you don't have to write this part, I'm just showing it to you. 2 to 4, 2 to 4, and 2 to 4. And then so on. So you can write them in, different ways, in all 3 ways. Okay, when you're finished with the page, it should look something like this. I think for box number 4, I added in an extra example so that you could see the way to multiply. But other than that, it should be very similar. So just make sure you have that, and then you're done. You're ready to work with ratios when you come to class. Good job.